One January when I was about 10 years old, my mum took us up to the Shetland Islands, for the pseudo-Viking fire festival of Uphold. It's like this big festival where people dress up and drink a lot, and there's a torchlit procession led by a group of what my granny refers to as portly, bearded fellas dressed as Vikings, and they like go through the streets and then like torchlit procession through the streets, and then they burn a replica Viking longship they've built by hand previously that whole year. So if there's a good place to start thinking about the strange and like amorphous phenomenon of masculinity, it's here. But not because of the portly bearded fellows who'd burn a boat. While we were up there that year, my mum took us, my brother, my sister and me, to the Clickamin swimming pool in Lerwick, which is it's a great swimming pool. It's got like flumes, it's got river rapids, and it's got this like outdoor pool, heated pool area, which for some reason was open in January. January is not warm in the Shetland Islands. So while we were darting about in the outside swimming pool with the warm water and the freezing cold January air, my brother, who must have been about 14 at the time, turns to me and he says, "John, if you walk around the outside of this pool 100 times, you'll prove to me that you're a real man." Being a skinny little middle child with low self-esteem, a true mystery why I became a YouTuber, I was absolutely compelled to leap at this brotherly challenge. I got out of the warm water of the swimming pool and into the freezing January air and proceeded to walk around the pool 100 times. I don't remember how long it took, but I remember the water burning my skin in the way that warm water burns as it comes into contact with cold skin, and that's how it felt when I leapt back into the pool. But I was proud, I was elated, I was big. I swam over to my brother feeling all big and proud, and I asked him, "Am I a real man now?" But he just turned his head slightly away from me and said, "A real man follows his own path," and swam away. And if there's any way to be introduced to the pointless, constant failure of trying to be a man, trying to perform masculinity, it's through this pointless, admittedly funny, but cruel prank by my big brother. Recently there's been some really good work on left-wing YouTube on masculinity and like the rise of the manosphere of like people like Jordan Peterson and fucking Pitbull's Wario Andrew Tate. Folks like that take up a lot of the internet airwaves and a lot of time is spent dunking on them. This video is not going to be like that. Instead, in this video, I want to think about like why masculinity exists, what's its function in capitalist patriarchy, what it feels like to perform it, and whether or not there is a potential for a revolutionary form of masculinity, one that's radically anti-patriarchal. So like my brother advised me all those years ago, I'm gonna follow my own path. Still fuming about that, I'm still mad at that. I've often found it like weird when older adults and women in particular express like a surprise that I like to cook or that I clean. I'm told I'm like well trained like a dog as if I can't just enjoy to do these things, as if I can't just enjoy cooking or that cleaning is demeaning. It kind of feels like how dads who look after their own kids simultaneously get like a bunch of extra credit over mums who do the same thing every day, but also get patronised at the same time. You know, they get told that they're babysitting their kids instead of like, you know, just being a parent. And I think this speaks to the sort of minimisation of the value of feminised reproductive labour and how men who perform such labour are both praised and patronised, how it both undermines and reinforces patriarchy. But all of this just sort of leads us to ask, what is masculinity and how does it reinforce patriarchy? What even is gender? In fact, I've posed too many questions already. I think at this point we can safely abandon the crude notion that sex is the biological category, whereas gender is like the social and historically constructed one. We can abandon that. For example, Judith Butler argues that sex is not a bodily given on which the construct of gender is artificially imposed, but a cultural norm which governs the materialization of bodies. It is an ideal construct which is forcibly materialized through time. It's not a simple fact or a static condition of a body, but a process whereby regulatory norms materialize sex and achieve this materialization through a forcible reiteration of those norms. Citing Judith Butler within minutes of an essay talking about gender is hardly walking your own path here, John, but we move. Butler's blurring of the sex and gender distinction rests on their notion of gender performativity, by which the repetition of acts and, crucially in their formation, the repetition of linguistic and discursive norms coalesce around the creation and recreation of these gender and sex regimes. Butler's concept on gender performativity has obviously been hugely, immensely influential in the field of gender studies, but it has been criticised by sometimes focusing too heavily on the discursive and linguistic area, with not enough attention paid to the material divisions of labour within society. Like, basically, how can we make this more Marxist? X gon' give it to you. Wait for you to get it on your own. Luckily, social reproduction theorists have paid this some attention. For example, Alan Sears adapts Butler's formation for SRT and argues that the attitudes of men towards their own bodies, those of women and those of other men, is in part based on experiences of labour and of preparing for certain forms of labour even in play. Gendered norms are not simply a discourse, but a set of everyday practices framed by a matrix of power relations that structure production and reproduction in capitalist societies. What Sears is pointing at is that the repeated acts of gendered performativity exist not just in the linguistic or discursive sphere, but within the material divisions of productive and reproductive labour that exist within capitalist patriarchy.
Isn't breakfast ready yet?
In a minute, dear.
Oh.
It's obviously not reducible to just those dimensions, but these dimensions are extremely important. And in fact, such gendered divisions of labour are essential for the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole. And in this sense, Sears is grounding the theory of gendered performativity within the specific historical context of capitalist patriarchy. The recreation of masculine and feminine subjects serves to reproduce capitalist society as a whole. And this is the function of masculinity and femininity, at least today. For social reproduction theorists, capitalist patriarchy, which is not patriarchy as such, as some sort of trans-historical phenomenon, but the particular condition of patriarchy as it exists today, developed through a process of primitive accumulation, where productive labour, which is labour which directly produces value for the capitalist, is separated from socially reproductive labour, which is labour which reproduces the labour power of the worker and of the general sort of wider conditions of capitalist society as a whole, which isn't directly producing value for the capitalist. And this reproductive labour is often, though not exclusively, done through the family unit. The family and the household is often the site for this sort of stuff. Socially reproductive labour is then delegated to feminised subjects and subordinated in value to productive labour. And bear in mind as we go on that I think this masculine notion of domination can be connected to the overvaluing of productive labour within capitalist society. Given the value of this productive, dominant and dominating form of labour and form of life in capitalist society.
Isn't breakfast ready yet?
In a minute, dear.
So this is only like a sketch of capitalist patriarchy, and if you want a deeper dive into that, I go into it in more detail in my video on neoliberal feminism. But what is essential to keep in mind here is that capitalist patriarchy is upheld in part on a material division of labour between productive and reproductive labour, which reproduces masculine and feminine subjects. The repeated performance of reproductive... Motherfucking cat. Extending Butler, we can argue that the repeated performance of reproductive labour reproduces the feminised gendered subjectivities and reproduces the historically constructed subjectivity and historically constructed category of women. And this division is also often present in queer spaces, where often the brunt of socially reproductive work still gets shouldered by femme subjects, which, you know, shows how this gendering and gendered performance of labour extends beyond any crude biological essentialism. But what about the production of masculine subjects and the production of men? Can I pose any more questions? So there's loads and loads written about the production, the process of production, feminine and feminized subjects via the material divisions of reproductive and productive labour. Written within Marxist feminism covers all that stuff really well. But there's far, far less about the reproduction of masculine subjects within that field. Sears, though, who we talked about earlier, does give us some insight into this process of producing masculinity within capitalist patriarchy.
Men develop their sense of embodiment in part through engagement in particular forms of work in the context of specific power relations. For example, in the early 20th century, as mass production developed, the Ford Motor Company developed management strategies organised specifically around masculine pride, grounded in providing for dependent family members and the ability to endure difficult, painful and tedious work. This relationship of work and household creates a certain sense of embodied agency that is very different than the one women might develop through unpaid labour in the household, which creates a very real economic dependence. The masculine pride of the professor, the miner and the taxi driver differ in important ways, yet are all tied to a particular configuration of work and household and a specific condition within the division of labour.
So Sears is highlighting here how the particular repetition of masculinized labour reproduces masculine subjects. Such subjectivities are often tied to like a breadwinner status, which, because of capitalist imperatives, whereby the accumulation of wealth is valued really highly, creates a need to achieve dominance within masculine subjects, with particular reference to the family.
Isn't breakfast ready yet?
Isn't breakfast ready yet? Isn't breakfast ready yet?
Remember the dominant value ascribed to productive work. We can also see here a kind of mechanization of the masculine body, which combined with masculine value being tied to engagement within the labour market, excludes and demeans certain groups such as disabled men for failing to perform masculinity in the socially prescribed way. I guess we all constantly fail at performing masculinity, but the degree of that failure in the eyes of society seems to act to discipline and exclude certain classes of people. Domination has to come with subordination, right? And such failures, which are tied to simultaneous domination and subordination, are features internal to masculinity. For example, Howson points out that for working class men,
hard work is a crucial component of masculinity, yet the workplace is a scene where the desire to work and achieve is mixed with such things as subordination to the boss's persistent authority.
The workplace is a site of both domination and humiliation, and not in a fun kink way. And this process leads to masculine subjects imposing domination via forcing the performance of reproductive labour in the household onto women, which you can still see today in the sort of post-ironic jokes about like women going into the kitchen to make men a sandwich, you know, that kind of shit. Shut up, women, and make me a sandwich. I'm so desperately insecure in my position in the world, I need to eke out a single moment of domination over you so I can feel powerful for a single second. Sandwiches. But this masculinity isn't stable. Capitalist masculinity wasn't created a few hundred years ago and then has remained the same ever since. Like, that would be a silly idea. And I'm not silly. I'm very serious.
There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house.
And indeed, evoking Butler, Howson argues that masculinity as a social phenomenon
does not represent a coherent unified system that is simply reproducible across time and space. Rather, masculinity is defined by configurations of practice and a system of gender relations.
For example, many people have pointed out that in the global north, in the post-war era, with the exporting of production to the global south, there was a change of labour practices of men in the global north, with the classic, macho, physical factory production work declining and being replaced with work which was feminised, office work, your email jobs and shit like that. Their means of domination changed because no longer did men have to show their masculinity, so through a sort of like performative demonstration of machismo, but the engagement with like the paid sphere of labour and continued uneven split in the delegation of household social reproductive work meant that it remained paradigmatic as a means of domination. And even when a small number of elite women can be said to have broken the glass ceiling and become successful breadwinners in their own right, arguably imitating and ultimately kind of reproducing and reinforcing notions of masculinized productivity being tied to domination, these women often remain responsible for household reproductive labour, either doing it themselves or via hiring other women to do it for low pay, women who are often migrants or racialised, or both. Even in my house growing up, my mum earned vastly more than my dad, but she still did the majority of the cooking, cleaning and childcare. So rather than a set of like stable conditions or cultural signifiers, masculinity can be said to be a constantly shifting concept built on domination. But this doesn't just dominate femininity within patriarchy, but as is implied by the exclusion of certain groups like disabled men, or racialised men, or the subordination of working class men to their bosses, one form of masculinity dominates others. One form is hegemonic. So coined by Connell, hegemonic masculinity highlights how masculinity is
Inherently relational, existing only in contrast to femininity. This relation is not a confrontation between homogeneous, undifferentiated blocks of men and women, but between multiple masculinities and femininities. For Connell, recognising the plurality of masculinities is only a first step, and the more important task is to examine the relations between them. Drawing on Gramsci's concept of hegemony, she theorises the dominant masculinity as hegemonic masculinity, the culturally exalted form of masculinity, and the configuration of gender practices which embody the currently accepted answer to the problem of the legitimacy of patriarchy. Hegemonic masculinity is not static, but responsive to changes in the conditions of patriarchy. Most men do not embody the hegemonic ideals, but they still benefit from the patriarchal dividend. That advantages men in general through the subordination of women. Their masculinity is complicit. Hegemonic masculinity dominates certain groups of men, notably gay men, with political and cultural exclusion, legal and street violence, and so on. These subordinate masculinities often have blurry boundaries with femininity. In addition, subordinate classes and racial minorities' masculinities are marginalised. These marginalised masculinities provide excellent images, such as black athletes, to be appropriated by the dominant group, as well as controlling images such as black men as rapists, which makes white, middle-class masculinity appear more legitimate. Therefore, marginalisation is always relative to the authorisation of the hegemonic masculinity of the dominant group.
So while we can say that there is a dominant form of hegemonic masculinity which is rooted in the divisions of labour in capitalist society which push domination, and breadwinning as the gendered ideal for masculinity,
a man provides for his family. He does it because he's a man.
there are simultaneously multiple subordinate and subaltern forms of masculinity which both shape and are shaped by this dominant hegemonic form. Take, for example, homonormative gay masculinities, whereby certain largely middle class, largely white gay men conform to an image of normality. They may, get married, work corporate jobs, form a nuclear family, and often still export the household reproductive labour to generally racialised and migrant women. Oftentimes they're really hostile to queer ways of being which are weird, which aren't normal to society as a whole. And so subaltern masculinities like this ultimately serve to uphold the ideals of hegemonic masculinity and ultimately patriarchy. Namely the nuclear family, but often to the gendered division of labour. Hegemonic masculinity, hegemony in general, has taken something which was formerly oppositional to it, gay subjectivities, and reshaped it in such a way so that it is no longer oppositional, no longer a threat to it, but actually, in weird ways, supports it. As Stuart Hall argues, hegemony is never complete and never stable, but it's always looking for ways to reform and reassert itself. So let's take a deeper look at how hegemonic and subaltern masculinities interact. In his study, Hassan tracks the ways in which masculinities manifest within migrant men who, much like migrant women, often perform the gendering, the feminized and racializing socially reproductive labour in the global north for middle class and, increasingly actually working class families. As many social reproduction theorists have pointed out, global flows of migration are a site of creation of a gendered global proletariat as the international division of reproductive labour becomes increasingly important for the reproduction of the global system of neoliberal capitalism. Basically, as reproductive labour has become increasingly commodified, it's undergone similar processes as other commodities under neoliberal capitalism, which is that it's been exported to global south subjects, in this case migrant men and women, and cheapened for consumption within the global north. And the effects of performing such feminized labour on migrant men is a really interesting insight into how masculinities form. It shows the ways in which hegemonic masculinity constantly seeks to reaffirm itself and reaffirm the gendered divisions of labour. Take this quote, which says that for these men,
the destabilising of patriarchal privileges and downgrading of social mobility due to migration combine with the gendered implications of entering a feminised job in the domestic sphere, often under female authority. At the same time, migrant men can reaffirm patriarchal hierarchies and values at home, and some can also withdraw from domestic or care services in search of better job opportunities.
So the repeated performance of feminised gendering labour might, at first appear for migrant men to be a disruption of the hegemonic masculine order, but by reaffirming the gender division of labour at home, the subaltern masculinity is folded into hegemonic masculinity and the division of labour is maintained. And while not all reproductive work is feminised, many migrant men are engaged in so-called non-nurturing labour, which tends to be less feminised, things like janitorial work or gardening work. But even with the performance of feminised socially productive labour, migrant men often find ways of eschewing a kind of feminised performativity while they do it. For example, men doing care roles often benefit from a kind of authority effect, whereby they're seen as exceptional for their existence within a care work position. Like I said earlier, the notion of me, a man, doing cooking and cleaning is seen as an exceptional achievement or something. And this is why, while migrant women often tend to have an edge, a slight edge on migrant men in trying to get jobs in the reproductive labour market, they still tend to have lower wages. And even outside of migrant labour, we can see this sort of effect take place. For example, while teaching is a disproportionately feminised job, the role of head teacher, of a principal teacher, is disproportionately held by men, by male subjects.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
These positions of authority mean that the domination of masculinity inherent to our current form of hegemonic masculinity is maintained while it might appear to be subverted. Similarly, Hassan argues that in order to reaffirm
the inferior or minority status of subordinate men, in the workplace men often engage with body-based masculine stereotypes which differently contribute to the constructed gender occupational cultures and, in the process of gendered subjectivities, are generated through interactions and resistance.
This sort of thing, this sort of kind of machismo, again, this kind of macho stuff about body-based performance, shows how men performing such feminized roles they don't necessarily eschew the dominant hegemonic masculine order, but can in fact in certain ways reinforce it. But we've got to be careful here. We shouldn't push such points too far and apply it across the board evenly, because many racialized men are excluded from such benefits of masculinity within social reproductive labour. For example, black male nurses are often construed as a hypersexualized threat within the workplace, while their competence at engaging in that work is constantly questioned. Such racialized dimensions have an effect both on the reproduction of hegemonic masculinities of middle-class male employers of domestic labour, who engage in this sort of labour via employment and view themselves as sort of protectors of the family unit from a kind of hyper-sexualized racial threat that they might face.
See, I got business associates who are black, and they don't want my son with their daughters, and I don't want their sons with mine.
You've been with a guy for 3 years who's been taking care of you. You're a couple. He's been paying the bills, looking after you. He slept with some idiot girl he doesn't care about anymore, and you're gonna go bang fucking Pedro.
Domination again sort of appears as a theme within the current construction of hegemonic masculinity. But obviously this also has an effect on racialized migrant labourers, who themselves are viewed of as in need of domestication. And part of this seems to be quelling this kind of hypersexualized and physical threateningness of foreign men, and instead making sure that they conform to patriarchal hegemonic ideals.
The training of migrant men thus involves turning them into good fathers and husbands in the immigration country and encouraging them to disassociate from deviant models of migrant masculinity. Thus, training practices of migrant domestic care workers aim at transforming their personal and family life, rather than simply instructing them on specific tasks involved in their future jobs. This is consistent with existing studies of reproductive labour, mainly focusing on female workers, which indicate that the employers want a specific kind of person for the job. The production of a good domestic care worker thus involves the domestication of migrant masculinities and cross-cuts the public-private divide to encompass his personal and family life.
So this quote is really useful because it highlights how the performance of certain tasks isn't enough for the production of subaltern masculinities within patriarchal hegemonic masculine orders. So instead, and in line with our social reproduction theory critique, which highlights the role of certain subjectivities associated with certain kinds of labour, migrant men are forced via both often violent coercion and consent, because, as Hassan points out, migrant men themselves sometimes felt the need to change their ways of being and perform this certain domesticated masculinity, and so they're forced to conform to kind of hegemonic patriarchal masculine norms of the family unit and the good husband and fatherhood and all that. And it's here we can see that there's a real disciplinary function of hegemonic masculinity within patriarchal capitalism. Conforming to hegemonic masculinity allows migrant men access to the labour market, but those who don't conform still continue to be viewed of as threats and hyper-exploited within the realms of socially reproductive labour that they can get access to. Upholding the nuclear family, in which patriarchs dominate, is essential in maintaining the larger scale gender division of labour upon which capitalist patriarchy rests. And thus here we can see how discipline and violence is used to uphold hegemonic patriarchal masculinity and patriarchal capitalism itself. So just to sum up this long ass section, which is the longest sort of section of this whole video, don't worry. Gender is reproduced via the repeated performance of certain gendered activities like socially reproductive labour, which is largely feminized. Hegemonic masculine ideas have been traditionally associated with the productive sphere of labour, whereby wage labour and providing for the family and being a breadwinner has produced a masculinity which is committed to the nuclear family and of dominating, and a masculine domination of that nuclear family.
Isn't breakfast ready yet?
Productive work is valued more highly in capitalist society, and so those who perform that productive labour are also valued more highly in society. But hegemonic masculinity is relational in that it is defined by its relation with femininity and with other subaltern masculinities. In examining the role of migrant masculinities, we can see how the performance of traditionally feminised social reproductive labour by migrant men doesn't necessarily disrupt the hegemonic patriarchal order, but through things like performing domination as part of that labour or reinforcing patriarchal domination within the home or the family, migrant men can actually reinforce hegemonic masculinity while performing feminised labour. So in this next section, we're going to look at what performing that masculinity and failing to perform that masculinity actually feels like. When I was 20, I worked in this nightclub in Edinburgh on George Street, so it was like really like kind of posh and filled with Tories, mainly filled with hen parties, bachelorette parties for the Americans in the audience. It was a terrible job, a really terrible job, but the worst part of it were these hen parties. Walking through this club, collecting glasses, you'd be constantly harassed, just over and over harassed by these middle-class women who would touch you, slap your ass, fucking grab your genitals, and like even at the time and for years later I kind of shrugged it off, like it was more of an annoyance than anything else. Like I wasn't in danger from these women, not really, and to be honest I kind of felt embarrassed, so I shrugged it off. But over time I began to feel more upset and angry that this sexual harassment was allowed to happen at my workplace over and over again over the course of the summer. And it's not as if nobody knew. Everybody knew. Every single male member of staff had this happen to them. But none of these women were ever spoken to about it. Never mind, like, chucked out of the club. Their money was more important than our right not to be sexually harassed in the workplace. And I imagine if I'd ever said anything to them, if I've ever like stood up for myself, I would have probably have been fired. Them being rich women afforded them the privilege to sexually harass us. And because we were men, we were expected to kind of like it. We were expected to enjoy the attention. We were expected to always want sex or always want sexual contact, so that these women just couldn't fathom that they were touching us without our consent, that they were sexually harassing us. But this notion that we always want sex is so internalized in men that for us to feel violated by this feels like a violation of masculinity. It feels like a failure of masculinity. So reflecting on these things hurts twice, through the acts themselves, but also through my failure at masculinity for not liking it. It's perverse, really. I want to talk about what it feels like at performing masculinity and what it feels like to fail at performing masculinity and what the function of those feelings is. So first, I think it's important to note what it feels like when you perform hegemonic masculinity well, because it can make you feel like kind of big, like important and domineering, like the swimming pool story. Before my brother shot me down, I felt like big and I felt powerful, I felt excited, it felt like I'd done something important, because in my mind, in the mind of me as a 10-year-old child, is that I'd been a man, I'd achieved this thing, this masculinity. And this sort of momentary elation of performing masculinity well can actually be extremely dangerous and can lead to some really damaging behaviours.
I'll hit you so hard in the face you'll be shitting teeth. Go right ahead. I can see the headlines right now.
I mean, I've definitely entertained fantasies about like winning arguments or like intellectually dominating folks, which has led to some, regrettable behaviours in the past. And it's one of the reasons why I think like debate culture on YouTube is like so pervasive and such bullshit, is because it rests on this sort of hegemonic masculine ideal of like intellectually dominating people.
Anderson, don't talk out loud. You lower the IQ of the whole street.
That masculinized domination, it feels good It can be addictive. I can understand why people get addicted to that feeling. And that sort of way in which this feeling good, this good addictive feeling about placing yourself in dominant position, I think plays a part in how those sort of really sad men like Andrew Tate talk about women. Women are viewed of as simultaneously a threat to these men and fundamentally inferior to them. And this sort of insecurity about not living up to this unattainable myth of masculinity drives these men to constantly try to place themselves in a dominant position, discounting women's opinions or referring to themselves as high value men, any number of simultaneously pathetically sad and deeply dangerous notions.
The easiest way to be a high value man is a man who's capable of violence.
It's as Bell Hooks says, that the first act of violence that patriarchy does is men's self-mutilation, as they abandon and forgo real love so that we can practice domination instead. And this sort of speaks to the other side of the addictive kind of good feeling of performing masculinity when you, in the brief moments when you do it well, and speaks to the sort of real feelings of failure where you don't live up to the masculinized ideal.
I am a man! And no, you don't. I'm irrelevant. No, go away. I'm irrelevant.
Like in the pool story, the flip side to my very momentary, brief form of feeling of elation of performing masculinity was the massive fucking letdown and humiliation where my brother shot down that notion. Similarly, and maybe more seriously, part of the feeling of being groped and harassed by hen parties, as I said, was I think in part tied to a feeling of shame that I hadn't performed masculinity properly. I'd been the one who was dominated, and I was, supposed to like being sexualized and all that stuff. Yeah, it's weird feelings, and we see these sort of weird maelstrom of feelings on display in those migrant men who perform feminized labour. Existing
studies on masculinity and migration suggest that men are significantly affected by class demotion in the migratory context because of the gendered ways in which they make sense of their personhood. They experience specific challenges in handling the implications of migration and downgraded social mobility, which crucially affect their self-identification as breadwinners. While they dramatically resent the destabilization of their self-image as heads of their household due to their dependence on social benefits, their wives' employment or their own low-paid, low-skilled jobs, and dwell nostalgically on their lost economic position or identity. Women take up the challenge of the downgraded social mobility and start all over again to sustain their household. In addition, scholars suggest that because femininity has not been traditionally associated with paid work, employment is more relevant to making sense of one's gendered self for men than for women. Male workers in feminized occupations may find that their choice of job is ridiculed, calling their manliness into question, or it's seen as a sign of homosexuality. Fear of stigmatization is also associated with the fact that these male workers are constructed as a sexual threat to the patients, the children, and the people they care for, and are exposed to accusations of sexual misconduct. Men working in jobs associated with caring are simultaneously sexualized, constructed as hypermasculine, and feminized. Indeed, male domestic care workers perceive an expectation to explain their employment in what's seen as an unnatural job for a man, and to prove their masculinity as well as their competence.
And what this all implies is that those feelings of elation at performing masculinity well, and the feelings of humiliation at failing at that performance, assuming of course that you're not deliberately eschewing masculinity by your own choices and by your own sort of aims to do something different. These feelings of domination and humiliation aren't just a quirk of patriarchy, but an active force in maintaining it. Maintaining the gendered and racialized divisions of labour on which capitalism rests. And, as a reminder, the constant repeated performance of which is instrumental in the recreation of gender itself. Working class racialized migrant men are more violently excluded from the performances and privileges of masculinity. And as such, they're more sort of ruthlessly disciplined through things like the psychological humiliation of failing to perform masculinity, but also, importantly, through the perception of them as threats and through their criminalization and segregation of such men. So the question of what it feels like to perform masculinity should be maybe reframed to the questions of like, why does it feel good and bad to succeed and fail in hegemonic masculinity? I remember when I was still in the Labour Party, campaigning for a Corbyn government, and I'd go door knocking or like canvassing sessions, and often the group was like immediately dominated by a really like loud, brash, domineering man, someone with a loud voice who shouted and he did the organising, and it always made me feel like vaguely intimidated and sort of vaguely inadequate as well, as if I had to be this person in order to be an effective organiser, to work effectively in these spaces. But that's not really me. It's not how I operate in the world. And something like about that held me back, I think. Like, it made me think, you'll never be one of the good loud organisers, so there's not really much point of you in this space. Unless you're doing this stuff, there's not much point of you. And I kind of think there's something deeply sad about that. So hegemonic masculinity within patriarchal capitalism serves to alter and limit the bounds of masculinity in such a way as to uphold that patriarchy. But one critique which is often levelled at Connell's concept of hegemonic masculinity is that it's often viewed of as a category in and of itself. Like toxic masculinity is like viewed of as hegemonic masculinity and interchangeably, rather than, as the Gramscian term itself sort of suggests, that it's a structural position which can take different and conceivably revolutionary forms. Gramsci's concept of hegemony does contain the many and insidious ways in which the current order co-opts any opposition to maintain itself. It uses opposition to fuel itself in certain insidious ways. But it also makes clear the various ways in which counter-hegemonic action can overthrow the capitalist hegemony and form its own sort of communist hegemony. Saying hegemony too many times. And I guess we can ask, like, does this apply to masculinity? Can we take these things and apply them to a concept like masculinity? And there's many writers who have argued, maybe not explicitly in Connell's terms, but they've argued for that we need to create a new form of anti-patriarchal, anti-hegemonic masculinity. For example, Bell Hooks argues that we need to offer men a different way of being. We must first replace the dominator model with a partnership model that sees interbeing and interdependency as the organic relationship of all living beings. In the partnership model, selfhood, whether one is female or male, is always at the core of one's identity. Patriarchal masculinity teaches males to be pathologically narcissistic, infantile and psychologically dependent for self-definition on the privileges, however relative, that they receive from being born male. Hence, many males feel that their very existence is threatened if these privileges are taken away. In a partnership model, male identity, like its female counterpart, would be centred around the notion of essential goodness that is inherently relationally oriented. So Hooks argues that for patriarchy to be overthrown, we need to fundamentally rethink what masculinity means. Others still have argued about the need to transcend certain gendered divisions of labour. And I think we can see shades of what this sort of change can achieve, not yet fully fulfilled, but in some of the ways in which migrant men report the change in their perspective on gender and divisions of labour within their household. After they've engaged in feminised labour, men's narratives end up questioning such naturalised and supposedly innate feminine qualities by pointing to the skills that they are able to gain through experience. Beyond this, however, through their involvement within the IDRL, that's the International Division of Reproductive Labour,
Migrant men also gain greater awareness of the care needs within their own houses and families, and may renegotiate their relationship to unpaid care work through performing emotional labour in the workplace.
So we can see here that there's some overcoming of the domination of masculinity, but it's certainly not enough. And I would argue, following from the social reproduction theorist's point, that production and reproduction are inherently connected, and that we need the abolition of the entire system, of the entire mode of production, and any sort of systems of value and normative judgment which are associated with that capitalist and patriarchal mode. The complete abolition of the state of things. I don't want to be reductive there and imply that, you know, once we create socialism, then we'll fix masculinity and it'll just happen automatically. That's not what I'm saying. One of the benefits of Gramsci's hegemony as a concept is that it maintains the importance of human agency in actively working to overcome capitalist relations. We can't just like rest on our laurels and assume that something as crude as seizing the means of production would automatically overcome patriarchal masculinity on its own. And there are many, many examples that you can point to within left spaces where patriarchal masculinity is thriving, whether that's through, you know, sexual harassment scandals and assaults within left organising spaces, or just like the dominance of kinds of patriarchal masculinity. A friend of mine, Kate, was talking about this as she's a union organiser herself, and she was talking about this thing recently, pointing to the ways that within the union movement there's the vast bulk of reproductive labour is still undertaken by women within the union movement, but also the spaces themselves are just filled to the brim with a load of masculinized forms of bravado and dominance, stuff that I pointed to earlier. And the left also contains forms of like protest masculinity, whereby men without access to the sort of hegemonic form rally around alternatives, and not always good alternative forms of masculinity. And to stretch that concept, I feel like this sort of protest masculinity is something which is present in some of the revolutionary fantasies of some left-wing men. They recognise the sort of degradation and domination of male subjects under capitalist patriarchy, but instead of trying to break down that idea of domination, they seek to kind of reform it through reaffirm a kind of masculinist dominance via notions of revolutionary violence, whether that's real or imagined, or through sort of exaggerating a kind of ideal of workers' masculinity, where like the ideal factory, the ideal working man is held up as the avatar of the revolutionary subject. And that's an image which is simultaneously mobilised in like deeply reactionary white supremacist ways and ableist ways, through the valorization of like work as the revolutionary, as the valuable act in society, and also obviously through in patriarchal ways. And this is not a critique of revolutionary violence as such. But how often do you hear about men talking about revolutionary violence without talking about revolutionary care? How often do you hear men talk about fighting a cop but not caring for their comrade? Revolution is live, and that means we have to embody all of it ourselves, which includes transcending masculinist fantasies of violence and practicing traditionally feminized caring and reproductive labour ourselves. Masculinity, like gender itself, is a really difficult topic to uncover, and this is just a really small introduction to that massive topic. Here we've seen how if gender is reconstructed and reproduced via repeated performances, divisions of reproductive and productive labour are central parts of these repeated performances. We've also seen how it's difficult to speak of just like one form of masculinity, but instead a regime of several masculinities which exist in relation to one another, with a hegemonic form influencing and being influenced by subaltern ones, all while working to maintain capitalist patriarchy. A key feature, in my view, of this hegemonic masculinity is domination. It's a thing which I think repeatedly comes up. And this domination is, I think, rooted in the valorization of productive labor. Domination over women and over other subaltern masculinities, and the failure of performing such domination creates feelings of frustration and shame in men, and leads them to engage in damaging, violent behaviours to overcome such feelings. But the concept of a hegemonic masculinity doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. As a structural category and not like a form of masculinity in itself, we can find ways to create new hegemony, not rooted in domination but in care. But I want to end on a provocation, because I don't know if I'm fully satisfied with the notion that we can create a new anti-patriarchal masculinity. I worry that in focusing on creating a new masculinity, we might ultimately end up reaffirming a sort of gender essentialism rooted in a gender binary of masculinity and femininity. Because ultimately, like, what is masculinity? I still don't know. I still don't know what it is. We've like identified a hegemonic masculinity and other subaltern masculinities, but what connects them? Post-structuralists often like to sort of disaggregate masculinities into different categories and often argue that this eschews any overarching logic, but does it? Like, because they're still labeling them masculinities, they're still calling them subaltern masculinities, so what makes them masculinities? What's the connective tissue there? There must be some like connective tissue, some logic to this, and the one that jumps out is an association with some like biologically reductionist notion of maleness, and frankly, that's not good enough for me. I don't think replacing a domineering masculinity with a caring one will sufficiently disrupt ideas of gender which are rooted in a biological essentialism and upon which our patriarchy rests. I think we need to do more. It's
our historical task, and only ours, feminists, to define what we call oppression in materialist terms, to make it evident that women are a class, which is to say that the category woman, as well as the category man, are political and economic categories, not eternal ones. Our fight aims to suppress men as a class, not through genocidal, but a political struggle. Once the class men disappears, women as a class will disappear as well. For there are no slaves without masters.
So after all this, after you sitting here for an hour, absorbing dense theory and listening to meandering argumentation, the conclusion that I've reached is: men are trash, get rid.
Alright, well, here we are at the end of the video. I hope this video does well, because it took a lot of work, a lot of reading, and frankly I fucking need it. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe and all the stuff, and comment and share it. I know that the earlier stuff is really dense and might take some like extra reading or reviewing to sort of grasp what's going on, but I hope you managed to get through that. As ever, thank you to my patrons. All $10 patrons get a wee shout out, so here we go. So thank you to Tom Price, Cade Swari, Esoteric Fictionalism, Shingo, Austin Talman, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Rich, Niels Owlgard, Tinfoil Pancakes, Aga Ghost, Daniel Hughes, Tamesh Kispeter, and Paul Singleton. If you want to sign up to my Patreon, early access to stuff, you get book reviews, you'll have seen this video before everyone on YouTube, and yeah, if you'd like to, I've also got a Ko-fi and a PayPal if you can't afford to subscribe to Patreon. I know it's a difficult time for everyone. Mainly though, if you've liked this video, please share it. I really need it. Yeah, so with all that said, here we are at the end. Thanks so much for watching. If you have watched, if you've not watched, you're not even hearing this, so I can say what I want to you, so fuck you if you've not watched. I hate you and I will never like you. Everyone who did watch, I love you all. Bye bye.